The reading glasses still held the shape of Robert's nose. I turned them over in my hands, tracing the worn temples where his fingers had adjusted them countless times over 38 years. 6 months since the heart attack, and I still found myself saving articles from the newspaper to show him, still brewing 2 cups of coffee in the morning before remembering. The house breathed around me in that particular way empty houses do, not quite silent, but waiting. I sat in his chair, the burgundy recliner that faced the lake, watching the late Oregon afternoon settle into the water like watercolor bleeding into paper. The memorial service was 2 weeks away. I had been planning it with the same careful attention I once gave to his birthday dinners, handwriting invitations on cream cardstock, choosing hymns he used to hum while shaving, arranging for his favorite foods to be served afterward. On the kitchen table, my lists lay organized in neat rows. Caterer confirmed, pasta scheduled, flowers ordered from the nursery, where Robert had bought me anniversary roses every year. I had ironed the lace tablecloth that morning, the one we had received as a wedding gift and saved for special occasions. It seemed important to get the details right, to honor him properly. I wanted everyone who loved him to feel his presence in the room, to remember not just that he had died, but how fully he had lived. My art supplies gathered dust on the shelf by the window. Watercolors I hadn't touched since Robert's diagnosis. Brushes stiff with neglect. There had been no time for painting during those final months of doctor visits and medication schedules. And now, somehow, there seemed to be both too much time and not enough. Too much silence to fill, not enough energy to fill it. The phone rang just as the sun disappeared behind the pine trees across the lake. I set down the glasses carefully and reached for the cordless handset, recognizing David's number on the small screen. I greeted him with the automatic brightness that always came when I heard from my son, telling him I had just been thinking about him. David's voice carried that particular warmth of a busy man making time for family as he asked how I was holding up, acknowledging that this week must be hard. I settled back into Robert's chair, pulling the soft throw blanket across my lap. I told him I was managing, then shared my excitement about the memorial plans. I had found that photo of Robert from David's college graduation, the one where he was wearing that ridiculous tie David had bought him, and thought we could display it near the guest book. I could hear David moving around in the background, the sound of papers rustling, maybe a coffee cup being set down. He agreed that it sounded perfect, that his father would have loved that. After a pause, he confirmed that the memorial was the 16th. I reached for the notepad where I had written everyone's responses, reminding him it was Saturday the 16th at 2 o'clock. I mentioned that I'd sent the invitation weeks ago and had him and Vanessa down as confirmed. The silence stretched just a beat too long. When David spoke again, his voice had shifted. Still kind, but careful now, like someone delivering news they wished they didn't have to share. He explained that he'd meant to call sooner, but things had been absolutely crazy. The problem was that Vanessa had a huge presentation that day for a Fortune 500 client, something that had been scheduled for months. She couldn't reschedule something this big. It could really impact her promotion. I felt something cold settle in my chest, like a stone dropping into still water. The word "oh" came out smaller than I had intended as I acknowledged what he was telling me. David continued, apologizing for the timing, explaining that they'd had no idea when the presentation was first scheduled. He mentioned how these corporate things worked, that the client was flying in specifically for this meeting. I stared out at the lake, now dark, except for the reflection of the porch light. A stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward until the whole surface was disturbed. I heard myself offering to move the memorial, suggesting I could call Pastor Williams to see if the following Saturday worked. The relief in David's voice was immediate and unmistakable as he called me amazing, acknowledging it was a hassle, but explaining that Vanessa had been working on this presentation for months. This could really make her career, he said. I closed my eyes and agreed, saying that family was flexible. That's what his father always said. David expressed his appreciation, suggesting that maybe the extra week would give more people time to arrange travel, that it might work out even better. We talked for a few more minutes about practical things: the weather, David's work, a funny story about their neighbor's cat. Normal conversation that felt anything but normal, words floating over the surface of something I couldn't quite name. When I hung up, the house seemed quieter than before. I sat holding the phone in my lap for a long time, watching the darkness settle completely over the water. The stone had stopped sinking, but the ripples continued to spread. I thought about Robert's face during David's college graduation, how proud he had looked in that ridiculous tie, how he had insisted on wearing it to dinner afterward, even though it clashed with everything else. The next morning, I began making calls. Pastor Williams was understanding but concerned. The church calendar was full, and moving a memorial service was unusual. The caterer sighed audibly and mentioned cancellation fees. Each conversation required an explanation, and each explanation made me feel smaller, as though I were apologizing for an inconvenience I had somehow created. I found myself repeating the same words to everyone, apologizing for the last-minute change, explaining that my daughter-in-law had a work commitment that couldn't be moved. My sister Rose asked the most pointed questions, wondering how Vanessa couldn't take one day off for Robert's memorial. What kind of job didn't allow compassionate leave? I deflected as smoothly as I could, explaining that corporate work was demanding these days, that this wasn't just any meeting, but a career-defining presentation. I insisted that Robert would have understood, though even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. I remembered how Robert had driven through a blizzard to make it to David's elementary school play, how he had rearranged important business trips to attend parent-teacher conferences. But that was different, wasn't it? David had been a child then, not a grown man with his own priorities. By Thursday, everything had been rescheduled. The cream cardstock invitations went out again with apologetic notes paper-clipped to the top. I re-ironed the lace tablecloth and updated my lists. I told myself it would be fine, maybe even better. More people might be able to attend. The extra week would give me time to prepare something even more special. But lying in bed that night, listening to the house settle around me, I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not anger. I wasn't the type to get angry about things that couldn't be helped. More like a slow recognition, the way you realize you've been walking in the wrong direction and aren't sure when you made the turn. The memorial service the following Saturday was everything I had planned it to be. The church filled with soft afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. Robert's favorite hymns played on the old organ. The photo from David's graduation sat prominently near the guest book, that ridiculous tie bright as a flag. David and Vanessa arrived 20 minutes late, slipping into a pew near the back, while Pastor Williams was reading from Psalms. I caught David's eye and smiled, a small wave of my fingers to let him know it was okay. Vanessa wore a black dress that looked expensive and kept her phone in her hand, checking it periodically, even during the scripture readings. During the reception in the church fellowship hall, I moved between the tables like a hostess at a dinner party, making sure everyone had enough coffee, that the elderly guests had comfortable chairs, that the photo displays were positioned where people could see them clearly. I found myself managing everyone else's comfort, making conversation with Robert's former colleagues, accepting condolences with the appropriate mixture of gratitude and grace. Vanessa spent most of the reception near the back of the room, talking quietly on her phone. I caught fragments of conversation as I passed by, something about client feedback and Monday morning follow-ups. When Mrs. Henderson from Robert's book club asked about Vanessa, I explained that she had important work calls to handle. Mrs. Henderson expressed sympathy for such demanding work, wondering how young people manage these days with all that pressure. David made his way around the room, shaking hands and accepting hugs, but I noticed he stayed close to wherever Vanessa was standing. When it came time for family members to share memories, David spoke briefly about his father's love of fishing and terrible jokes. His words were warm and genuine, but I found myself wishing he would look at me while he spoke, instead of at some point just over my shoulder. They left before the cleaning was finished, Vanessa mentioning an early flight the next morning for another business trip. David hugged me goodbye in the church parking lot, a quick squeeze that barely touched my shoulders. He told me it had been beautiful, that their father would have been so proud of me. I stood in the empty parking lot afterward, watching their rental car disappear down the tree-lined street. The afternoon had grown cold, and I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. Inside the fellowship hall, a few church ladies were stacking chairs and covering leftover food with aluminum foil. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by leftover casseroles and flower arrangements. The house quiet except for the refrigerator's gentle hum. The memorial had been everything I had planned. Respectful, well attended, full of love for Robert's memory. But sitting there among the evidence of a day well managed, I felt like a guest in my own grief. I realized I had spent the entire afternoon making sure everyone else was comfortable, that their needs were met, that they felt welcomed and cared for. I had monitored the coffee pot and restocked the tissue boxes and made sure the elderly guests didn't have to stand too long. What I hadn't done was simply sit with my own sadness, or let myself feel the full weight of saying goodbye to the man I had loved for nearly 4 decades. The stone had settled at the bottom now, but the water was still disturbed. I folded my hands in my lap and sat very still, listening to the silence of a house that no longer needed to accommodate anyone but myself. For the first time since Robert's death, I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or the loneliest sound I had ever heard. Spring arrived tentatively in Oregon, the way it always did, with false starts and sudden retreats, cherry blossoms one day and frost warnings the next. I found myself marking time by David's phone calls, which came every 2 weeks now like clockwork, always on Sunday evenings, always brief. He would check in, asking how I was feeling. The question had become routine, delivered with the efficiency of someone completing a task. I would give my standard answer. Fine, keeping busy, the weather had been nice. And David would respond with the appropriate sounds of concern before moving to practical matters. He asked whether I had been sleeping well, if I was eating enough, whether I had thought about what I might do with Robert's tools in the garage. 3 months after the memorial, the conversations began to take on a different quality. David started asking questions that felt less like care and more like inventory. Was the house feeling too big for me? Had any repairs come up that I couldn't manage? Was I finding it expensive to maintain such a large property on my own? I would answer honestly, yes. Sometimes the house felt empty, but it was filled with memories I wasn't ready to pack away. No, I wasn't struggling financially, though I was more careful about expenses now that it was just my social security and Robert's pension. I found myself reassuring David that I was managing fine, as though my competence was something that needed defending. David would express his worries about me being out there by myself, while I could hear Vanessa's voice in the background, usually talking to someone else about groceries or weekend plans. He would say it was a lot of responsibility for one person. The calls always ended the same way. David saying he loved me, that he and Vanessa would try to visit soon, that I should call if I needed anything. But the visits never materialized. And when I did call with small news, the neighbor's dog had puppies. I'd seen a bald eagle over the lake. David's responses felt distracted, his attention clearly elsewhere. In May, they came for Mother's Day weekend. I spent the week before their arrival cleaning rooms that were already clean, shopping for ingredients to make David's favorite meals, and arranging fresh flowers from my garden in every room. I had hoped this visit might recapture some warmth, some of the easy closeness we'd once shared. Vanessa noticed the space first, before she'd even set down her overnight bag. She stood in the entryway with her hands on her hips, surveying the living room like she was calculating square footage, remarking on how huge the place was. When I told her there were 4 bedrooms, plus Robert's study, Vanessa noted that the study could be a bedroom too, if someone needed it to be. Vanessa walked through the main floor with the purposeful stride of someone conducting an assessment. She commented on the hardwood floors, the lakefront view, the mature landscaping. Everything she said was complimentary, but I felt like I was being appraised rather than admired. Vanessa remarked that the property taxes alone must be brutal, running her hand along the built-in bookshelves Robert had installed himself 20 years ago. She mentioned how expensive it would be to heat a place this size in winter. Over dinner, the conversation turned inevitably to practical matters. David asked about my daily routine, how I spent my time, whether I was finding it lonely. I described my quiet days, gardening, reading, the occasional lunch with neighbors, and watched Vanessa's expression grow increasingly concerned. Vanessa leaned forward, asking what would happen if something occurred, if I fell, or had a medical emergency. Her voice took on the tone of someone explaining something important to a child, as she pointed out that my nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. I had lived in this house for 30 years without incident, had raised David here, had nursed Robert through his final illness here. But under Vanessa's questioning, my competence began to feel questionable, my independence something naive rather than admirable. I mentioned quietly that I had medical alert devices, that Mrs. Patterson next door checked on me regularly. David agreed that medical alert devices were great, but pointed out that response times out here weren't like they were in the city. He noted that Mrs. Patterson was 78 herself, asking what would happen if she needed help. They meant well, I told myself. They were concerned about my welfare. But sitting at my own dining room table, listening to them discuss my living situation as though I weren't present, I felt something shift inside me, a recognition that I was being managed rather than consulted. When Vanessa excused herself to take a work call, David helped me clear the dishes. For a moment, it felt like old times, mother and son moving around the kitchen with familiar efficiency, the easy rhythm of shared domestic tasks. David acknowledged that Vanessa was right to be concerned, saying the place was beautiful, but a lot for anyone to handle alone. He asked if I had thought about what I might want to do long term. I paused in wrapping leftovers, studying my son's face, asking what he meant. He explained that he was just talking about planning ahead, being realistic about what made sense as I got older. He mentioned that there were some really nice communities now, active living places where I'd have my own space, but also support if I needed it. Less isolation, more social opportunities. I responded that I wasn't isolated, that I had friends and a life here. David acknowledged that he knew I did, clarifying that he wasn't saying I needed to make any decisions now. He suggested it might just be smart to start looking at options while I was still healthy and could choose what I wanted. After they left on Sunday afternoon, I found a business card tucked under the ceramic bowl where I kept my car keys. Vanessa's neat handwriting on the back read Sunset Manor Senior Living Community with a phone number. Underneath, in smaller script, just in case you want to explore options. I held the card for a long time, then placed it in the junk drawer next to expired coupons and dead batteries. The house felt larger than usual that evening, but not in the way Vanessa had meant. It felt spacious, like a room where I could finally breathe. The grief support group met every Thursday evening in the basement of the community centre, a circle of folding chairs under fluorescent lights that hummed like distant insects. I had resisted going for months. I wasn't the type to share personal matters with strangers, but my doctor had mentioned it gently during a routine visit, and something about the way he'd said it made me reconsider. I arrived early the first time, nervous energy making me fidget with my purse strap as other people trickled in. The group was smaller than I'd expected. 7 others, mostly women, all older than I'd imagined. I had prepared myself for tears and dramatic stories, but the atmosphere was surprisingly calm, almost ordinary. The facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Janet, explained that this was a space for sharing without advice giving, for listening without judgment. People could talk, or simply sit. There was no pressure to perform grief or to be anywhere other than exactly where they were. Dorothy spoke first. She was 78, small and sharp-eyed, with silver hair cut in a no-nonsense bob. Her husband had died of cancer the year before, and her children had moved her to assisted living without asking her opinion. Dorothy explained matter-of-factly that they had meant well, said she shouldn't be alone, that she needed support, that the house was too much responsibility. But what they really meant was that her being alone made them uncomfortable. It was easier for them if she was somewhere they could check a box and stop worrying. I felt something tighten in my chest, a recognition I hadn't expected. Helen was 71, a retired teacher whose daughter had gradually taken over her finances temporarily after her husband's stroke. The temporary arrangement had become permanent when Helen's grief made her seem fragile, unreliable. Helen shared quietly that her daughter paid her bills now, managed her investments, made her doctor's appointments. She was very efficient about it. But Helen couldn't buy a book without explaining why she needed it, couldn't donate to charity without a discussion about whether it was wise. Others shared stories that varied in detail, but shared common themes. Adult children who confused love with control, families who mistook grief for incompetence, the gradual erosion of autonomy disguised as care. I listened without speaking, but something was loosening inside me, a knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. When Janet asked if I wanted to share, I shook my head, not ready yet. But I knew I would be back. After the meeting, I found myself walking to my car beside Dorothy, who moved with a cane, but used it more like an accessory than a necessity. Dorothy asked if it was my first time, though it wasn't really a question. I confirmed that it was, admitting I wasn't sure what to expect. Dorothy smiled, explaining that most people thought grief support meant crying together. Sometimes it did. But mostly it meant recognizing you weren't the only one figuring out how to live in a smaller world. I drove home through the spring darkness, windows cracked to let in the smell of apple blossoms and fresh earth. The house looked different as I pulled into the driveway. Not isolated or overwhelming, but peaceful, settled, like something that had grown exactly where it was meant to be. That night, I pulled out the art supplies I hadn't touched in over a year. I didn't paint anything particular, just colours bleeding into other colours, the way grief moved through the spaces Robert's absence had left behind. Not filling them, but finding a way to live alongside them. For the first time since the memorial, I went to bed without wondering if I was managing well enough, without second-guessing my choices or measuring my competence against someone else's concerns. I was simply a woman who had lost her husband, who was learning how to be alone without being lonely, who was beginning to understand the difference between solitude and isolation. The business card stayed in the junk drawer, covered by accumulating debris of daily life, grocery lists and spare buttons, and the small, necessary clutter of a woman who was no longer apologizing for taking up space. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late June, breaking my new routine of coffee and watercolors on the back porch. I had been experimenting with painting the way light moved across the lake at different times of day, not trying to create anything beautiful, just practicing the act of paying attention. David's voice carried an energy I hadn't heard in months, the enthusiasm of someone who had solved a problem. He said he was glad he'd caught me, explaining that Vanessa had found something he thought I was really going to love. I set down my brush and reached for the towel I kept nearby for cleaning my hands, asking what it was. David explained it was a community called Riverside Gardens. Really upscale. More like a resort than what I probably thought of when I heard senior living. He described individual cottages, beautiful landscaping, a whole activities program. The best part, he said, was that they had a waiting list. But Vanessa knew someone who knew someone, and they might have an opening. I watched a blue heron pick its way along the shoreline, moving with deliberate grace through the shallow water. I acknowledged that it was thoughtful of them both to look into it. David continued with growing excitement, explaining that they would need to move pretty quickly if I was interested. Vanessa's contact said they rarely had availability, and when they did, it went fast. He suggested we could drive down that weekend, just to take a look. No pressure, just exploring options. I dipped my brush in clean water, watching the paint bloom outward like a small storm. I told him that weekend wouldn't work for me. After a pause, David asked if I had plans. I confirmed that I did, though I didn't elaborate. The truth was simple. I was painting Saturday morning, attending a potluck with the grief group Saturday evening, and spending Sunday reading a novel I'd been looking forward to all week. Plans that would have seemed insignificant to the Margaret who had rescheduled her husband's memorial. But that felt essential to the woman I was becoming. David suggested we could do it another weekend, but emphasized that he really thought I should see this place. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed perfect for me. He mentioned there was even an art studio where residents could take classes. Something in his tone, the assumption that I would naturally want what he had decided was good for me, brought my full attention back to the conversation. I told him I appreciated his looking into it, but that I wasn't planning to move. David acknowledged that change was hard to think about, but explained this wasn't just any senior living place. This was like a resort where I'd have my own space, but also built-in community. He urged me to think about it. No more worrying about maintaining the house, no more isolation, people my own age to socialize with. I responded quietly that I wasn't isolated, and that I was quite happy with my current social life. I could hear Vanessa's voice in the background, though not the words. David's tone shifted slightly, became more urgent. He mentioned that the financial advisor Vanessa had found had run some numbers. The equity in my house could easily cover the buy-in, plus leave me with income for monthly fees. I'd actually be in better financial shape and have way less responsibility. I asked if he had discussed my finances with a stranger. David clarified that it wasn't a stranger but a professional, someone who specialized in retirement planning. He insisted they had only shared general information, nothing specific. They were just trying to look out for my future. I set my brush aside and stood up from the small table where I'd been working. The heron had moved further down the shore, still searching patiently for whatever it was seeking. I told David I needed him to listen to me carefully. I wasn't moving. I wasn't interested in looking at communities. I wasn't planning to make any major changes to my living situation. I was settled here, and I was happy here. David started to object, but I cut him off, saying I wasn't finished. The words came out more sharply than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them. I explained that I also needed him to stop discussing my personal affairs with people I didn't know. My finances, my living situation, my daily routine. These were private matters. If he had concerns about my well-being, he could discuss them with me directly. The silence that followed felt different from his usual pauses. This one had weight to it. Surprise. David finally said he didn't realize I felt that way, that they were just trying to help. I told him I understood that, but I didn't need the kind of help they were offering. After I hung up, I sat on the porch steps, my bare feet in the warm grass. I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a stillness that came not from emptiness, but from resolution. The conversation had required a kind of clarity I'd forgotten I possessed, a willingness to state my needs without apologizing for having them. That afternoon, I called Carol Brennan, an old colleague from my art therapy days who had transitioned into elder law after her own retirement. We met for coffee the following morning at a cafe downtown, Carol's sharp eyes taking in my request with professional interest. Carol repeated my request. I wanted to establish a trust, and asked if there was any particular reason for the timing. I chose my words carefully, explaining that I wanted to make sure my affairs were organized according to my wishes, not someone else's interpretation of what was best for me. Carol nodded without surprise, asking if there were family pressures. I described them as family concerns that felt like pressures. We spent an hour discussing my assets, the house, Robert's life insurance, savings accounts, the small but steady income from my pension and social security. Carol explained how a revocable trust would work, how it would protect my autonomy while providing clear instructions for the future. Carol explained that the beauty of this arrangement was that I would maintain complete control during my lifetime. No one else could make decisions about my property or my care without my explicit consent, regardless of their relationship to me. I signed the papers the following week in Carol's office, my signature steady and deliberate. I changed my emergency contacts from David to include Dorothy and Helen from the grief group, women who understood the difference between support and supervision. I updated my medical directives to reflect my own values rather than assumptions about what family members might want. The administrative tasks felt symbolic, each form a small declaration of independence. But the real change was internal, a recognition that I had choices, and that making them clearly was an act of self-respect rather than selfishness. David called the following Sunday, his voice cautious. He said he'd been thinking about our conversation the previous week, that he didn't mean to overstep. I told him I knew he didn't, and meant it. He was trying to help in the way that made sense to him. When he asked if we were okay, I confirmed we were. But I told him I needed him to understand something. I wasn't the same person I was 6 months ago. Losing his father had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I wasn't fragile, and I wasn't confused. I was just different. David asked how I was different. I looked out at the lake, where the evening light was beginning to gather in pools of gold and amber. I explained that I used to think love meant saying yes to everything, accommodating everyone else's needs before my own. I was learning that sometimes love meant saying no clearly, so that when I did say yes, it meant something. David said he didn't want me to feel like I had to handle everything alone. I responded that I wasn't handling everything alone. I had friends, I had support, I had a life here that worked for me. What I didn't have was someone else making decisions for me based on their comfort level rather than mine. 3 weeks later, David came to visit, alone this time, Vanessa busy with a work commitment that couldn't be moved. I had been prepared for awkwardness, but instead found something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of relationship. He arrived mid-morning on a Saturday, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt instead of his usual pressed shirts and khakis. He helped me weed the vegetable garden, his hands remembering the rhythm of work we'd once shared when he was young. We didn't talk much while we worked, but the silence felt comfortable rather than strained. Over lunch, he asked about my art. Really asked. Not the polite inquiry of someone making conversation, but genuine curiosity about what I was creating and why. I found myself describing the pleasure of watching colours move across wet paper, the way painting taught me to see light differently. David mentioned that he remembered me painting when he was little, that I'd had an easel set up in the sunroom. I acknowledged that I had given it up when he started school. There never seemed to be time after that. David asked if I regretted giving it up. I considered this, saying I regretted thinking it wasn't important enough to make time for, but I didn't regret having it to come back to now. When he left that evening, our goodbye felt different. Less obligation, more choice. David didn't mention senior communities or financial planning. He didn't assess my competence or catalogue my vulnerabilities. He simply hugged me goodbye and said he loved me. And I heard in his voice something I hadn't heard in months: respect for who I was rather than concern about who I might become. That night, I pulled the business card from the junk drawer and tore it into small pieces, feeding them to the flames in my fireplace. I watched the fragments curl and blacken, carrying away the last remnants of someone else's definition of what my life should look like. I was 66 years old, widowed, alone in a house some people thought was too big for me. But sitting by the fire with my cat purring in my lap and my latest painting propped against the mantel, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Robert's illness: the deep satisfaction of a life being lived according to my own design, answerable to my own conscience, rooted in my own choices. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There had been no confrontations, no burned bridges, no declarations of independence. Just a woman learning to trust her own judgment again, discovering that the space Robert's death had created didn't need to be filled by someone else's vision of safety. It could be filled with my own quiet authority, my own gentle certainty about what mattered and what didn't. Outside, the lake reflected the stars like scattered seeds of light. I turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the water lap against the shore, feeling for the first time in months like I was exactly where I belonged. The first anniversary of Robert's death fell on a Thursday in October, when the maple trees around the lake had turned the colour of copper pennies and the morning air carried the sweet scent of apples ripening in nearby orchards. I woke before dawn, not from sadness, but from anticipation. Today would be different from the memorial I had rescheduled a year ago. Today would be mine. I had planned this gathering carefully, but not in the anxious way I once planned events around other people's comfort. This time, my choices reflected what felt true to Robert's memory and meaningful to my own heart. I invited only people who had genuinely known and loved him: his Thursday night poker group, the neighbours he'd helped with storm damage, the librarian who had special ordered his mystery novels, and the 3 women from my grief support group who had never met Robert, but understood what it meant to honour love. The service would be at the house, on the back porch that faced the lake Robert had loved. No formal programme, no schedule to keep, just people gathering at 2 o'clock to share memories and eat his favourite foods. I had made his mother's apple cake from the recipe card stained with decades of use, and Dorothy was bringing the cornbread Robert had always requested at potluck dinners. As I set out chairs on the porch, arranging them in a loose circle rather than formal rows, I felt the deep satisfaction of creating something that honored both my grief and my growth. This wasn't a service managed around other people's availability. It was an invitation to those who wanted to be present, offered without accommodation or apology. David had called the week before to ask about the date. His voice carried the careful tone of someone testing boundaries. He mentioned that he had a conference in Portland that week, but said he could probably reschedule the Thursday sessions if I needed him there. I had paused, considering. Not whether I wanted him there. I did. But whether his presence would change the gathering into something designed around his comfort rather than my intention. I told him I'd love to have him if he wanted to come, but asked him not to rearrange his work obligations. This wasn't a formal service that required family attendance, I explained. It was just a gathering for people who wanted to remember his father together. David asked if I was sure, saying it felt important. I agreed that it was important, and that it would be meaningful whether he was there or not. The honesty of this statement surprised us both. A year ago, I would have insisted it didn't matter while secretly feeling abandoned if he didn't come. Now I genuinely meant what I said. The gathering's value didn't depend on anyone else's validation of its importance. In the end, David didn't come. The conference couldn't be rescheduled after all, and I received a text that morning wishing me peace and saying he was thinking of me. I read it without disappointment, recognizing that his absence was simply a fact rather than a rejection. The afternoon was crisp and golden, the kind of October day that made me understand why Robert had insisted on moving to Oregon despite my initial reservations about leaving the familiar rhythms of our Midwest life. People arrived with quiet warmth, settling into chairs with cups of coffee and plates of food, the conversation flowing naturally between present observations and past memories. Helen told the story of how Robert had spent an entire Saturday helping her late husband repair their dock after a winter storm, refusing payment but accepting her offer of dinner. Mrs. Patterson shared how he had quietly shoveled her driveway every snow for 15 years, always before she woke up, never mentioning it unless she happened to catch him at it. The poker group brought a flask of the whiskey Robert had favoured, taking turns sipping it and telling increasingly exaggerated stories about his terrible bluffing skills and his habit of humming while he considered his cards. Each story built on the others, creating a portrait of a man who had moved through the world with quiet kindness and terrible jokes, who had believed in helping neighbours and reading good books and taking time to watch the seasons change over water. I found myself laughing in ways I hadn't since before Robert's illness, not the polite laughter of social obligation, but the helpless, healing laughter that comes from recognizing someone you loved in stories that surprise you with their accuracy. I hadn't known about the driveway shoveling, hadn't realized how much the poker group had treasured his presence, hadn't understood how many small kindnesses he had offered without ever mentioning them to me. As the afternoon light began to slant low across the porch, the gathering took on the gentle quality of a good conversation that has found its natural rhythm. People shared quieter memories. The way Robert had made everyone feel listened to, his gift for asking the kinds of questions that invited real answers, his ability to be present without trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. Dorothy, who had never met Robert, but had listened to me talk about him during long Thursday evenings at the grief group, spoke last. She told me directly that she hadn't known my husband, but she knew what he had given me because she could see it in who I had become. He had loved me in a way that made me stronger, not smaller. And that was the rarest kind of love there is. As people began to leave, offering hugs and thanks for including them, I felt something settle inside me. Not the heavy finality of an ending, but the quiet satisfaction of a circle completed. This gathering had been exactly what I'd hoped for: honest, unhurried, focused on love rather than loss. I spent the evening cleaning up slowly, not from obligation, but from pleasure in the domestic ritual of restoring order after meaningful disruption. The apple cake had been completely consumed, the whiskey flask emptied, the chairs marked with the impressions of bodies that had sat in them, sharing stories worth telling. Later, as full darkness settled over the lake, I walked down to the small dock Robert had built our second year in the house. I carried with me a single white candle and a letter I had written to him that morning, not words of goodbye, but of gratitude for what his love had taught me about my own strength. I lit the candle and set it carefully on the dock's wooden railing, watching its reflection tremble on the dark water. Then I read the letter aloud to the night air, my voice steady and clear. I told him that I knew now what he had always tried to tell me, that love didn't require me to make myself smaller, that caring for people didn't mean managing their feelings, that I could be generous without being invisible, helpful without being silent. I folded the letter and placed it beside the candle, not to burn or send away, but to witness this moment of recognition. Tomorrow I would file it with other important papers, a record of the woman I had become in the space his death had created. The candle burned for an hour while I sat on the dock, my feet dangling in the cool air above the water. I wasn't waiting for signs or messages, wasn't trying to feel Robert's presence or absence. I was simply being present myself, in my own life, in my own skin, in my own choices. When I finally blew out the candle and walked back to the house, I felt complete in a way I hadn't experienced since before Robert's illness, not because I had recovered what I'd lost, but because I had discovered what I'd always possessed: the capacity to love fully without losing myself, the wisdom to know the difference between solitude and loneliness, the quiet authority that came from trusting my own judgment about what mattered and what didn't. At 67, I was a widow living alone in a house some people thought was too big for me, tending a garden some might consider too ambitious for a woman my age, pursuing art some would call a hobby rather than serious work. But sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tomorrow's plans taking shape in my mind, painting class in the morning, lunch with Helen, volunteer work at the animal shelter in the afternoon, I felt rich with the particular wealth that comes from living according to your own design. Outside, the lake reflected the stars like scattered promises of light. I turned off the kitchen lamp and stood at the window, looking out at water that had held Robert's reflection and now held mine, understanding, finally, that some things are not meant to be replaced, only transformed. That grief could become wisdom, loss could become space for growth, and goodbye could become a different kind of beginning. I was exactly where I belonged, not because someone else had decided it was safe or practical or appropriate for a woman my age, but because I had chosen it with the clear sight that comes from knowing your own worth. And that, I realized, was Robert's final gift to me, not his presence, but the confidence to trust my own.